My name is indeed Mark Hallerberg from the Herties School of Governance. We're going to have a panel, I think, that feels a bit more informal. We're a smaller group. We're going to sit around in terms of a semicircle and have a discussion not only among ourselves, but we hope also with you about political economy here in Europe. Now, if you haven't been involved in the planning, you may not know some of the background to putting this all together. Almost a year ago, several of us talked about what should we do for a panel on political economy in Europe, if we indeed are thinking about changing the debate. And we thought about a few things. One is, we're not only about the euro crisis, we're interested in crises. We're interested in the effect of crises that may bring out problems that were already there, that may make some things that seem hidden very obvious after the fact. But we are also interested in overall trends. That is, again, it's not about the decision-making processes just at the European level during one specific crisis, but what has happened in the past and how have things moved and where perhaps are we going in the future. Now, if you look at this panel, I think what you'll see are a variety of views, and I should say I'm both proud of that and I think you should see that that's also intentional. We have political scientists and economics on this panel, economists. You will hear, in terms of accents, you will hear German, Greek, Portuguese, and in fact this rather strange American accent. That is, you've got people from different places thinking about where is Europe headed. And again, that is also intentional, even though at the very core of this, of course, we're bringing together the London School of Economics as well as the Herties School of Governance and the Mercator Stiftung to think about these things. In terms of the program, we're all going to speak about 10 minutes each. We're going to have a very brief discussion among ourselves to get discussion going, and then we will invite you to join that discussion.
I would like to introduce our second speaker of this afternoon's panel, which is Daniela Schwarzer from the Stiftung Wissenschaft und Politik. Daniela is the head of research on the European Integration Unit. She was last year an advisor to the Polish government in preparation of the Polish presidency. She was also a correspondent of the Financial Times Deutschland in France earlier. And the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Anke. Thank you, Mark. I've been asked to look at the EMU and its governance structures, the way they have developed through the crisis, and my question is, what has happened and what is to last? And what I actually do in the paper, I sort of start with three assumptions. And those assumptions are about drivers that changed the institutional and governance phase of the Eurozone. Because if we talk about a governance crisis in the Eurozone, the answer should be that something is happening, not only with a big and grand new treaty debate, but that things have actually changed over the last 18 months of debt crisis management. And I look at three drivers of integration. One of them is the Lisbon Treaty. And you may argue, well, the Lisbon Treaty doesn't really say much about the EMU. And my argument is, but it says a lot about the European Council. The second driver is day-to-day crisis management. My argument is that through day-to-day crisis management, actually facts have been created, path dependence has been created, that prescribes explicit institutional reform that comes afterwards. And that's precisely my third point. Obviously, institutional reform has been underway in the European Monetary Union for the last 3 years, starting with financial market supervisory structures, financial market regulation, and so on. And it has now come to a point where actually a new change of the EU treaty is being investigated. Let me start with my first example, and in the paper I run through 5. Here I can only sort of mention them, but I study 5 cases. And the first one is really the Lisbon Treaty and the change it has brought to the European Council. Obviously, the European Council has a new president, and accidentally this new office came into force when the sovereign debt crisis was about to start. And if you look at the first few months of the way President Van Rompuy handled his new job, you can see that he explicitly seized the crisis, and in particular the Eurozone crisis. And he managed to do this very well. He set an agenda first for the European Council, but within the first year of his office it turned more or less into a Eurozone agenda. He managed to take power and impetus in terms of strategic impulse from the European Commission. He managed to set up structures such as it was the Council formally, but he was obviously behind it, such as the Van Rompuy Task Force, which prepared a reform that was in a way shadowed by the legislative procedure launched by the European Commission. And I think what we can see now is that the European Council has turned into the key decision-making body in the EU and as a Euro summit in the Eurozone. And it is, in a way, apart from the traditional institutional triangle. So if this is the rising star, where are the fading stars or the falling stars? For me, the Commission is not yet a falling star, but definitely a fading star in that system. It has definitely lost capacity to define long-term policy orientations, and it hasn't been able to really give an impulse in strategic reflection on the governance questions, in my view. It does struggle for its role in policy coordination, that is obvious. It struggles for its role in determining the governance reform agenda, and it has secured an operational role which is stronger in surveillance and sanctioning procedures after the crisis than it used to be before the crisis. But my argument would be that it is more and more dependent on the member states. It can act when the large member states wanted to, but it is, as we have seen with the first reform of the Stability and Growth Pact and the story that lay behind that reform, let's say the political independence of the Commission is fading more and more away. The obvious falling star in that game is the rotating presidency of the European Council. First of all, the Lisbon Treaty takes two key jobs away from the rotating presidency. That is chairing the European Council because it's Van Rompuy, and chairing the General Council because it's Mrs. Ashton. So the two most prominent politicians of the rotating presidency are no longer really visible. The problem was that for the rotating presidencies in the last 18 months, that crisis management actually transferred really decision-making to A, the Eurozone, and B, the European Council, as I have said. And in particular, as we now have a row of rotating EU presidencies who are not in the Eurozone, there were power struggles to be in the circles, but it never really worked. And we can say that they have been bystanders in this process. The EP for me is a kind of blinking star. Sometimes it's not visible, and sometimes it is very present. It is definitely on the side when it comes to the debate on how the crisis should be handled, how the governance structures should be reformed. The European Parliament created a special committee in order to get involved in that debate, and here we can say that the political impact has been rather weak. Where it is much stronger is, of course, in legislative procedures, and we have seen the six-pack come up, the reform of the Stability and Growth Pact and of the macroeconomic surveillance procedure, where the European Parliament has been a co-decider, and to the surprise of many, it actually ran against the position of the finance ministers in the legislative process and managed to get parts of the key points where it was about more interference with national policy making back to the initial Commission proposal. So it really managed to strengthen the supranational element, at least in this legislative procedure. Now that is the kind of background with Lisbon and the way the crisis has put this into practice. My second point is about power relationships in that context. If we say European Council, it's in my view speaking about the large member states. As the large member states always enjoyed preferred access to the Commission President, they now do to the European Council President. So Angela Merkel and Nicolas Sarkozy have always been able to access Van Rompuy. They have been able to crucially define the agenda not only of the European Council meetings, but also, for instance, of the Van Rompuy Task Force, where certain issues that at least one member state, where eventually we are sitting here, didn't want to have on the agenda simply slipped off after the first meeting. So we can clearly see that the large member states can make use of this new intergovernmental powerhouse, which is the European Council. Now, while Germany felt being criticized unjustly in the first phase of the sovereign debt crisis for not acting quick enough, and we can discuss all the reasons, I don't have time to do that now, Germany was criticized for dragging her feet. But if you look at what happened beyond solving the Greek crisis or beyond solving Portugal and Ireland, Germany has successfully managed to push a governance reform agenda, which essentially consists in bringing, in my interpretation, the European Monetary Union back to the model Germany thought it had signed with the Maastricht Treaty. So there's a lot of consistency in all the proposals put forward, and I think while German media tend to evaluate Franco-German summits in a way that we always give in to the French, I think at the end of the day this was a quite successful strategy of pushing and institutionalizing ideas of how EMU should work, and I'll come to that later, what policy agenda should actually be followed. My third case is the role of the European Central Bank. And to put it in one sentence, it is obviously the only institution that was willing and able to swiftly act in the sovereign debt crisis, because it is supranational, because it has a clear institutional self-interest to handle that crisis in a way that its sort of responsibility, the euro, doesn't break apart. And because it had the capacity to extend its instruments in a way that it could actually do something in day-to-day crisis management. The securities market program is the obvious example, but in addition, the European Central Bank took other responsibilities on board, and that was, for instance, a bilateralization of conflict between the ECB and single member state governments. Take Italy. The letter that Mario Draghi and Trichet wrote to Berlusconi to impose a domestic policy agenda in order to sort of push reforms, and saying clearly we won't intervene into the secondary bond market. There are two more cases, and they have to be very brief. The new kid in town, obviously, is the European Financial Stability Facility and the ESM, which, in my view, has the potential not only as a crisis mechanism for sovereign debt crisis management, but also to become a kind of hub for economic policy coordination in the future. I will be very short here, but I'm happy to explain later. And the fifth package of things I wanted to abort is definitely the explicit economic governance reforms that have been launched. That is the six-pack I already mentioned. That is the Euro Plus Pact, and that is also the European semester, plus the Council conclusions of Wednesday a week ago, where the heads of state and government of the Eurozone went pretty far in predetermining the future institutional evolution of the Eurozone summit, its administrative structure, and so on. So I'd like to sum up in 4 points what the new face of the EMU is, in my view. The first observation is new actors have come to the scene, and they have gained crucial importance not only in crisis management, but in long-term determination of policy outcomes. I mentioned the European Central Bank, I mentioned the EFSF and the ESM. The second observation is that we are clearly already now moving towards a closer institutionalization of the Euro core. I've given you some examples. Now, I think the interesting thing is here that we are not clear yet how we are going to handle the relationship with the member states who are not in that core. That is going to be the key debate in the discussion whether the EU treaty should be revised in which way. And the second question here is, are we actually still assuming that the pre-ins are pre-ins, or are they moving sort of further to the fringe and may lose interest in joining EMU because it has changed so much since they joined the EU? My third observation is that, quite contrary to what we heard this morning, if an economic government develops for the Eurozone, I don't see it evolve out of the European Commission, but I see it evolve from the European Council. The summit conclusions of Wednesday, 26th of October, go very much in that direction, and I do not think, while it says, yes, the Commissioner for Economic and Financial Affairs should be strengthened, I think we've moved very far down an intergovernmental lane, and I don't see this is going to change. The fourth point is that all those governance reforms are closely linked to an explicit economic policy agenda. I've mentioned the Euro Plus Pact. Of course, the macroeconomic imbalance procedure is not neutral in any way. It is about raising competitiveness, and attached to this is a very detailed idea how this should happen. So what this means, in my view, is that we are heading for a period where, in particular, the member states who are under tight budgetary constraints and who are sort of sanctioned by the financial markets will see through the new governance mechanisms and the very detailed policy agenda their scope for economic policy making severely constrained, and financial markets will use the sort of European programs as a benchmark for their evaluation. And that brings me to the final conclusion that we are heading for a period where I assume we are not only going to discuss the efficiency of the governance mechanisms that are in place, but the legitimacy. Because, and that's my last sentence, the democratic element in all this governance reform is not yet on the table, and I think it's the big topic for the future discussion on treaty revisions to come, whether this element shouldn't very urgently be brought into the debate. Thank you very much.